Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Marcus Webb had been hiking the Appalachian backcountry for 15 years, but he'd never seen a cabin quite like the one he stumbled upon that October evening in the Nantahala National Forest. The structure sat in a clearing off the beaten path, about 8 miles from the nearest marked trail in western North Carolina. The sun was dropping fast behind Waya Bald, and Marcus knew he wouldn't make it to his planned campsite before dark. The cabin appeared abandoned, its logs weathered to a silver gray, but the roof looked intact and the door hung straight on its hinges. He approached cautiously, calling out a greeting that echoed unanswered through the darkening pines. The door opened with a slight push, revealing a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed frame in the corner. Dust covered everything in a thick blanket, and the air smelled of old wood and dried leaves. Marcus checked his GPS. No signal, which wasn't unusual this deep in the mountains. He decided to stay the night. As he arranged his sleeping bag on the floor, preferring it to the questionable bed frame, Marcus noticed something odd about the dust patterns. On the table, clear spaces outlined objects that were no longer there, a rectangular space that might have been a book, circular rings from cups or jars, the impression of what looked like a kerosene lamp. But it was the handprint on the dusty window that made him pause. It was fresh, pressed against the glass from the inside, fingers splayed wide as if someone had been looking out desperately. The print was still there, clear and undisturbed by time, yet the dust around it was inches thick. Marcus told himself it was his imagination working overtime. He'd seen the cabin from outside. No one had been here in years, maybe decades. He started a small fire in the fireplace, using wood from a neatly stacked pile beside the hearth, noting absently that the wood seemed too well preserved for an abandoned structure. As the flames caught and warmth filled the room, Marcus heated his camp meal and tried to shake the growing unease settling over him. The first strange occurrence happened around 8 o'clock. Marcus was studying his trail map when he heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps that crossed from one side to the other, then stopped at the door. His heart hammered as he stared at the wooden planks, waiting for a knock or the handle to turn. Nothing came. After 5 minutes of silence, Marcus gathered his courage and yanked the door open. The porch was empty. The forest beyond stood silent and still, not even a breeze to rustle the leaves. He closed the door and wedged one of the chairs under the handle. His rational mind offered explanations. An animal, settling wood, his own nerves. But his instincts, honed by years in the wilderness, told him something else. Something was wrong with this place. Around midnight, Marcus woke to the sound of breathing. Not his own. This came from across the room, near the bed frame. Slow, raspy breaths that seemed to struggle for each intake of air. He grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Empty. The breathing stopped the moment his light touched the bed frame, but in that brief illumination, Marcus saw something that made his blood run cold. The dust on the floor showed disturbances, the clear impression of bare feet walking from the bed to the table, from the table to the window, from the window to the door, then back to the bed. The tracks were fresh, pressed into dust that had been undisturbed moments before. Marcus didn't sleep again that night. He sat with his back against the wall, flashlight in hand, watching those footprints slowly fade as if the dust was settling back into place, erasing the evidence of whatever had made them. But more tracks appeared. Throughout the night, he watched as invisible feet paced the cabin floor, following the same pattern over and over, bed to table, to window, to door, to bed. Always the same route, as if locked in an endless loop. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, Marcus heard something that nearly broke his resolve to stay until full daylight. A voice, barely audible, whispered near his ear, "Please don't leave me here again." It was a woman's voice, desperate and pleading, and it came from right beside him, though he could see nothing but empty air. Marcus bolted from the cabin as soon as he could see the trail. He hiked for 3 hours straight, not stopping until he reached the ranger station near Wire Gap. The ranger on duty, an older man named Caldwell, listened to his story with an increasingly grim expression. When Marcus finished, Caldwell pulled out a faded file from a locked drawer. The cabin, Caldwell explained, had belonged to the Patterson family in the 1950s. A young woman named Eleanor Patterson had lived there with her husband, Thomas. In the winter of 1957, Thomas left Eleanor alone in the cabin while he went to town for supplies. A freak snowstorm hit the mountains, one of the worst in recorded history. Thomas tried to return but couldn't get through. When the snow finally melted 3 weeks later, they found Eleanor dead in the cabin. She'd run out of firewood and food. The tracks in the snow told the story. She'd paced the same pattern for days, walking from the bed to the table where she'd check their dwindling supplies, to the window to watch for her husband, to the door to see if she could leave, then back to bed to conserve warmth. Over and over until she was too weak to continue. The cabin had been abandoned since then. Several hikers had reported similar experiences: footsteps, breathing, the sense of someone trapped and waiting. The Forest Service had tried to burn it down twice, but both times the fire mysteriously went out, leaving the structure untouched. Marcus never returned to that section of the Nantahala. He still hikes the Appalachians, but he carries detailed maps now, marking locations to avoid. The cabin appears on none of them, existing in a gray area between official trails, but he knows it's still there. And sometimes, on cold October nights, when the wind blows down from the mountains, Marcus swears he can hear that whispered plea echoing in his memory. "Please don't leave me here again." He wonders if Thomas heard it too, every day until he died in 1982. If the guilt of leaving her followed him as relentlessly as Eleanor's ghost follows that endless path through the cabin, walking the same route she walked in her final days, still waiting for a rescue that will never come. Jennifer Cho booked the cabin through a vacation rental site, attracted by the low price and the promise of complete isolation in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains. She needed the solitude. Her divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, and her therapist had suggested a digital detox in nature. The property listing showed a charming 2-room cabin with a covered porch, positioned on something called Deadfall Ridge in the Tennessee backcountry. The host, listed only as Armash, had excellent reviews, though Jennifer noticed they were all from single renters who'd stayed alone. The drive up the mountain took longer than expected. Her GPS lost signal about 5 miles from the main highway, and she had to follow printed directions that led her up increasingly narrow dirt roads until she reached a rutted track barely wide enough for her Subaru. The cabin materialized through the trees just as the sun touched the western peaks, a sturdy structure that matched the photos with smoke already rising from the chimney. Jennifer felt a flicker of concern. She'd been assured the cabin would be empty, cleaned and ready. She parked and approached cautiously, calling out a hello. No response. The front door stood slightly ajar, and when she pushed it open, she found the interior warm and welcoming. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace. The beds were made with crisp linens. A note on the rough pine table read, "Welcome, Jennifer. Made things comfortable for you. Enjoy your stay. Armash." It was a nice touch, Jennifer thought, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just missed the host by moments. The fire was too fresh, the room too warm for someone to have left hours ago. She checked the bedroom and the small bathroom, both empty. She was alone. The first night passed uneventfully. Jennifer cooked a simple dinner on the propane stove, read by lantern light, and fell asleep to the sound of wind through the pines. She woke once around 3 a.m, thinking she had heard footsteps on the porch, but when she looked out, she saw only darkness and the silhouettes of trees. The second day, Jennifer decided to explore the ridge. The cabin sat near the edge of a steep drop, and a rough trail led along the ridgeline through dense forest. She hiked for about an hour, enjoying the exercise and the crisp mountain air, before the trail split. The main path continued along the ridge, but a smaller, less maintained trail branched off and descended into a hollow. Something about that descending path bothered her, an instinctive aversion she couldn't explain. She stuck to the ridgeline and headed back to the cabin. That evening, things began to change. Jennifer was preparing dinner when she noticed the photographs. They hung on the cabin walls, old black and white pictures in simple frames that she hadn't really looked at before. Now, studying them more carefully, she felt ice spread through her chest. The photos showed the cabin from various angles and distances, but in each one, a figure stood on the porch or visible through a window. The same figure in every picture. A tall man in dark clothing, his face always turned away from the camera, or blurred just enough to obscure his features. Jennifer told herself they were just old family photos, probably the original owner or builder. But then she noticed the dates penciled on the backs of the frames. 1983, 1991, 2003, 2015, 2024. The most recent photo was dated just 3 months ago. The cabin hadn't changed at all across 40 years, and the figure remained the same in each image. Ageless, eternal, always present. She took down the 2024 photo and studied it closely. The figure stood exactly where she'd stood that morning, looking out from the porch toward the trail she'd hiked. And though his face was blurred, something about his posture suggested he was looking directly at the camera, or rather, directly at whoever would eventually look at this photo. That night, Jennifer locked both the front door and the bedroom door. She tried to convince herself she was being paranoid, that the isolation was playing tricks on her mind, but around midnight she heard it clearly, the front door opening. The distinct creak of the hinges, followed by the soft thud of the door closing. Footsteps crossed the main room, slow and measured. They stopped outside her bedroom door. Jennifer held her breath, phone in hand, though she had no signal to call for help. The footsteps resumed, moving away toward the kitchen area. She heard the scrape of a chair being pulled out, the settling of weight. Someone was sitting at the table. For the next 3 hours, Jennifer lay rigid with terror while the presence remained in the outer room. She heard occasional movements, the creak of the chair, footsteps to the fireplace and back, the soft sound of pages turning as if someone was reading a book. At dawn, the sound stopped. Jennifer waited another hour before gathering the courage to open her bedroom door. The main room was empty. The fire had been rebuilt and was burning steadily. On the table sat a cup of coffee, still steaming, next to a book she'd left on the nightstand in the bedroom. The book was open to a page she'd marked the night before. Jennifer packed her bags within 15 minutes. As she loaded her car, her hands shaking, she saw it. A man standing at the edge of the woods where the trail descended into the hollow. Tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face somehow unclear even in the morning light. He didn't move, just watched her with an intensity she could feel across the distance. She drove away faster than was safe on that rutted track, her car bouncing violently over stones and holes. When she reached the main highway and finally got cell signal back, Jennifer immediately tried to contact Marsh through the rental platform. The account had been deleted. The listing was gone. But when she checked her bank statement, her payment had been refunded in full, with a note that simply said, "You weren't supposed to see him. Previous guests never did." Jennifer filed a report with the local sheriff's office, demanding they check the property. 3 deputies hiked up to Deadfall Ridge the next day. They found no cabin, The coordinates Jennifer provided led to an empty clearing surrounded by trees that looked like they'd been undisturbed for generations. The sheriff told her she must have been mistaken about the location, that the isolation and stress had confused her. But Jennifer knew better. She still has the photo she took from the cabin wall, the one dated 2024. And sometimes, when she looks at that blurred figure on the porch, she swears his face is becoming clear. Trevor Morrison inherited the cabin from his grandfather in the spring of 2023. The old man had been a logger in the West Virginia mountains during the 1960s and 70s, working the steep slopes of the Monongahela National Forest before the industry declined. The cabin had been his base camp, a place to stay during the week when the logging sites were too far from town to commute daily. Trevor's grandfather rarely spoke about those years, and when he did, his eyes would take on a distant, troubled look that discouraged further questions. The inheritance came with a locked metal box that Trevor's grandfather's lawyer presented with explicit instructions. Don't open it until you've spent a night in the cabin. Your grandfather was very specific about this. Inside the box, the lawyer said, were documents related to the property and something his grandfather had called necessary information. Trevor drove up from Charleston on a Friday in late April, curious about the property and already mentally calculating its potential sale value. The cabin sat at the end of a deteriorating logging road, about 12 miles from the nearest town of Webster Springs. The structure was larger than he'd expected. A solid 2-story building with a stone foundation, built to withstand harsh mountain winters. The logs were dark with age and treatment, and the small windows gave the place a fortress-like appearance. He found the key where the lawyer said it would be, under a specific stone in the foundation. The door opened stiffly, hinges groaning, revealing an interior that smelled of old wood and something else. Something organic and faintly sweet that Trevor couldn't quite identify. The main room held rough furniture, a large fireplace, and a steep staircase leading to the second floor. Everything was covered in dust, but beneath it, the cabin seemed remarkably well preserved for having sat empty for nearly 2 decades. Trevor spent the afternoon cleaning and exploring. The cabin was stocked with old supplies, canned goods from the 1970s, tools, rope, a few pieces of ancient logging equipment mounted on the walls. The second floor held 4 small bedrooms, presumably for the logging crew. One room was different from the others. The door was heavier, reinforced with metal straps, and it locked from the outside. Inside, Trevor found the walls covered in scratches, deep gouges in the wood, some forming patterns that looked almost like words, though the letters were malformed and impossible to read. As darkness fell, Trevor built a fire and settled in to open his grandfather's box. Inside, he found the property deed, some old photographs of logging crews, and a thick journal bound in leather. The journal was his grandfather's, filled with entries spanning from 1968 to 1972. Trevor began to read. The early entries were mundane, logs of work completed, weather conditions, notes about equipment and supplies. But around the middle of the first year, the tone changed. His grandfather wrote about sounds in the woods at night, like trees falling in the distance, but when the crew investigated in the morning, they found no freshly fallen timber. He wrote about crew members complaining of nightmares. Always the same dream, being chased through endless forest by something that moved between the trees, something that rustled and creaked like wood, but moved with terrible purpose. Then came the entry that made Trevor's mouth go dry. Found Hollis wandering on the logging road at dawn. He's been missing for 3 days. He can't remember where he's been, but he's different. His eyes are wrong. The crew refuses to work with him. I've locked him in the back bedroom until I can figure out what to do. God help me. When I look at him, I don't think I'm looking at Hollis anymore. Something else is wearing his face. Trevor looked up from the journal toward the stairs. toward that reinforced bedroom. His grandfather had locked someone in there. The scratches on the walls suddenly took on a horrifying new context. Someone had tried desperately to claw their way out. He forced himself to keep reading. The entries became increasingly frantic. His grandfather wrote about Hollis changing, his body becoming stiffer, his skin taking on a bark-like texture. He stopped eating, stopped speaking, just stood at the window staring out at the forest. The crew abandoned the site. His grandfather stayed, convinced he couldn't let Hollis leave, couldn't let whatever had happened to him spread beyond the mountain. The final entry was dated December 17th, 1972. It's been 4 months. Hollis is gone. I don't mean he escaped. I mean he's gone. I checked the room this morning and found only a pile of bark and leaves arranged in the rough shape of a man. The window was sealed from the inside. The door still locked. He just came apart, turned back into forest. But I hear him out there at night, walking around the cabin. I hear lots of them now. The trees here aren't what they seem. The forest takes people sometimes, and it sends them back changed. I'm leaving this place, and I'm never coming back. Whoever inherits this cabin needs to know. Don't stay here more than one night. Don't go into the woods after dark. And if you hear someone calling your name from the trees, don't answer. It's not who you think it is. Trevor finished reading just as full darkness settled over the mountain. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the room. That's when he heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy footsteps that didn't sound quite right, like wood creaking under weight, but also like something organic. Something that had once been human, but wasn't anymore. The footsteps circled the cabin. Trevor could track them by sound, across the porch, down the steps, along the side of the building. More than one set now. 3, 4, maybe more. And then came the voices, calling from the darkness beyond the windows. Trevor, Trevor Morrison. Come out, Trevor. Come home to the woods. They knew his name. They knew who he was. Trevor grabbed his car keys and made for the door, but something stopped him, a memory of his grandfather's instruction. Don't go into the woods after dark. The path to his car was 50 yards through the trees. He'd have to leave the cabin, leave the light, move through darkness where those things were waiting. He spent the night barricaded inside, listening to the circling footsteps and the voices that called his name, in tones that grew increasingly angry, increasingly inhuman. Through the windows, he caught glimpses of figures between the trees, humanoid shapes that moved wrong, their bodies too stiff, their movements jerky and wooden. In the firelight, he could see their skin had a bark-like texture, their fingers too long and branching like twigs. At dawn, the sound stopped. Trevor waited another hour, until full sunlight filled the clearing, before venturing outside. The ground around the cabin was covered in tracks, not footprints exactly, but depressions in the earth shaped like feet, surrounded by small roots and scattered bark. Trevor drove away from that mountain without looking back. He sold the property through a lawyer to a logging company, never disclosing what he'd experienced. The company's crew lasted 3 days before abandoning the site, reporting equipment malfunctions and workers disappearing for hours, only to return with no memory of where they'd been and a strange, blank look in their eyes. The cabin still stands. The Forest Service has reported it as an anomaly, an area where compasses don't work reliably, where hikers report getting turned around even on clear trails, where the trees seem to move when you're not looking directly at them. Some say if you go there at night, you can hear voices calling from the woods, using names of people who've been dead for decades, inviting them to come home. Trevor never opened the last page of his grandfather's journal, the one that had been glued shut. Years later, overcome by curiosity and several drinks, he steamed it open. On that final page was a single sentence in his grandfather's handwriting. I think Hollis is still alive in there somewhere, trapped inside the tree that his body became, still conscious, still aware. The forest doesn't kill us, it transforms us. And that's so much worse. Sarah and David Brennan booked the cabin for their honeymoon, wanting something different from the typical beach resort. They'd both grown up camping and hiking, and the idea of a week in a remote Appalachian cabin appealed to their sense of adventure. The listing promised rustic charm, mountain views, and a location so secluded you'll feel like you're the only two people in the world. They arrived at the cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia on a sunny Saturday afternoon in June, their SUV loaded with supplies for the week. The property exceeded their expectations, a beautifully maintained log cabin with a wraparound porch, situated on a bluff overlooking a mist-filled valley. The interior was thoughtfully appointed with handcrafted furniture, a modern kitchen, and a massive stone fireplace. A guest book sat on the coffee table, filled with enthusiastic reviews from previous visitors. Sarah picked up the guest book that evening while David prepared dinner. She flipped through the pages, reading comments from couples who'd stayed there over the past 5 years. Most entries gushed about the beauty, the privacy, the romance of the setting. But as Sarah reached the earlier entries, she noticed a pattern that made her pause. Several couples mentioned hearing sounds at night. Footsteps, whispers, the creak of floorboards. Most dismissed it as the cabin settling or wildlife outside. One couple wrote, "Weird dreams here. Both of us kept dreaming about another couple in the cabin with us. Super vivid. Still a great stay, though." Another entry, dated 3 years ago, was more unsettling. "We both saw her, not just dreams. On the 3rd night, there was a woman standing in our bedroom. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress and she was crying. When I turned on the light, she disappeared. Might have been shadows and exhaustion, but we decided to leave a day early. Beautiful place, but something feels sad here." Sarah showed David the entries. He laughed it off, suggesting previous guests had been drinking or reading too many ghost stories. They enjoyed their dinner, watched the sunset from the porch, and went to bed feeling content and happy. The dreams started that first night. Sarah dreamed she was still in the cabin, but it was different, older, more rustic. She stood in the main room watching a couple arguing. The woman was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair and a long dress that belonged to a different era. The man was older, his face hard and angry. Sarah couldn't hear their words, but the rage in his expression was terrifying. The woman backed away from him, toward the door, her face a mask of fear. Sarah woke with a gasp, finding David still asleep beside her. The room was dark and quiet. She told herself it was just a dream, probably inspired by reading that guest book entry. But then David began talking in his sleep, his words distinct and troubled. "Don't hurt her. Please don't hurt her. She's sorry. She's sorry." In the morning, David described having the same dream, watching a couple argue in a version of their cabin that looked older, more primitive. He'd seen the man strike the woman, seen her fall. The details matched Sarah's dream perfectly, even though neither had mentioned specifics before David shared his experience. They might have dismissed it as a strange coincidence if not for what they found that afternoon. While exploring the property, David discovered an old well about 50 yards behind the cabin, hidden by overgrown vegetation. The well was covered by a rotting wooden platform and a rusted iron grate. When they cleared away some of the growth and looked down, they saw something pale resting on rocks about 15 feet below, something that looked disturbingly like fabric, like the remains of an old dress. Sarah called the local sheriff's office. A deputy arrived within an hour, a young man named Collins, who seemed skeptical until David showed him the well. Collins made some calls, and by evening, a team had arrived with equipment to excavate the well. Sarah and David watched from the cabin porch as floodlights illuminated the scene. The deputies brought up human remains, a skeleton wearing the rotted remnants of a dress that matched the one from Sarah's dream. The deputy who'd been coordinating the excavation came to the cabin, his expression grim. The bones showed signs of trauma, he said. This was a crime scene, probably decades old. They'd need to process the area. Could Sarah and David give statements about how they'd found the well? While Sarah described their discovery, carefully omitting the dreams, David mentioned the cabin's history. Did the deputy know anything about previous owners? Collins consulted his notes, then nodded. The cabin had been built in 1924 by a man named Jeremiah Foster. He'd lived there with his wife, Caroline, until 1927, when Caroline disappeared. Jeremiah claimed she'd run off with a traveling salesman, but the family had always been suspicious. Jeremiah lived in the cabin for another 30 years, until his death in 1957, never remarrying, never speaking about his missing wife. That night, Sarah and David decided to stay. Despite the sheriff's suggestion, they find a hotel. They felt a strange obligation to remain, as if leaving would be abandoning Caroline Foster to the loneliness of her unmarked grave. The dreams came again, more vivid than before. This time, Sarah experienced Caroline's perspective, felt the terror as Jeremiah's hands closed around her throat, felt the suffocating darkness of the well, the cold water and rocks below, the slow realization that no one would come, that she would die here, forgotten. Sarah woke screaming. David held her as she sobbed, but his face was pale and drawn. He'd had the same dream, felt the same sensations. They weren't just observing anymore. They were experiencing Caroline's death, living her final moments. They stayed awake the rest of the night, lights on, holding each other. At dawn, something changed in the cabin. The heaviness lifted. The air felt lighter, as if a pressure had been released. When Sarah looked at the guest book, she found a new entry written in flowing script that neither she nor David had made. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for making sure I'm not forgotten. May your marriage be blessed with all the love and happiness that mine was not. CF." The forensic analysis confirmed the remains were those of Caroline Foster, dead approximately 90 years. The cause of death was strangulation, followed by disposal in the well while she was still alive. The case was officially recorded as a murder, and Caroline's family, distant cousins who'd wondered about her fate for decades, finally had closure. Sarah and David stayed for the rest of their honeymoon week. The dreams didn't return. Instead, the cabin felt peaceful, welcoming. On their last night, Sarah placed wildflowers by the well, now marked with a temporary memorial, while Caroline's family arranged for proper burial. They still visit the cabin occasionally. It's under new ownership now, and the story of Caroline Foster has become part of the property's history, told honestly rather than hidden. Guests report feeling a peaceful presence, sometimes noticing the scent of lavender that Sarah was told had been Caroline's favorite. The guest book entries no longer mention fear or unease. Instead, couples write about feeling blessed, about their relationships growing stronger during their stay, as if something in that cabin wants to see love succeed where it once failed so tragically. Mitchell Torres had been a wilderness survival instructor for 8 years, leading groups through the Appalachian wilderness and teaching them to navigate, build shelters, and survive with minimal equipment. He prided himself on his rationality, his practical understanding of nature and physics. There was no mystery in the woods that couldn't be explained by biology, geology, or weather patterns. That certainty lasted until he found the cabin in the Cherokee National Forest of eastern Tennessee. Mitchell was on a solo trek, scouting new routes for his company's advanced wilderness courses. He'd veered off trail following what looked like an old fire road, thinking it might lead to an interesting teaching location. The road ended at a cabin that made no architectural sense whatsoever. From the outside, the structure appeared normal. A single-story log cabin with a covered porch and one visible door. But when Mitchell opened that door and stepped inside, he entered a space that shouldn't have fit in the building he'd seen from outside. The room was massive, at least 40 feet square, with a high ceiling and walls lined with doors. He counted them quickly. 12 doors, including the one he'd entered through, each identical except for brass numbers mounted at eye level. 1 through 12. Mitchell stepped back outside to confirm what his eyes had seen. The cabin from outside was perhaps 20 feet wide, definitely not large enough to contain the space he'd just witnessed. He walked around the structure, just 4 walls, normal proportions, no wing or extension that could explain the interior dimension. When he went back inside, the massive room with 12 doors was still there, still impossible. His rational mind struggled for explanations. An optical illusion, some trick of perspective. But he could pace the room, measure it with his footsteps. It was genuinely 40 feet across. Mitchell decided to investigate the doors. He tried door 1 first. It opened into what looked like a normal cabin bedroom with a single bed, a dresser, and a window looking out onto forest. But when Mitchell looked out that window, he didn't see the forest he'd walked through. The trees outside were different, larger, older, with massive trunks that looked like old-growth timber that hadn't existed in Tennessee for over a century. He closed door 1 and tried door 2. This opened into another bedroom, but the style was different. More modern, with a metal bed frame and what looked like furniture from the 1950s. The window here showed a snowy landscape, though it was mid-July outside. Mitchell could feel cold air emanating from the room. Door 3 revealed a kitchen, fully equipped but covered in dust. Door 4 opened into what looked like a child's room, with toys scattered on the floor and crayon drawings on the walls. The drawings showed stick figures of a family in a house. This house, Mitchell realized, recognizing the cabin's distinctive shape. But one drawing showed something else among the stick figures, a tall, dark shape with too many arms, standing behind the family. Mitchell's scientific curiosity warred with growing dread. He should leave, report this place to authorities, to researchers who could properly document this impossible structure. But he couldn't stop opening doors. Door 5 contained a bathroom where water still dripped from a rusted faucet. Door 6 was a storage room filled with provisions, canned goods, tools, boxes of old clothes. Door 7 held only a chair facing a blank wall. When Mitchell opened door 8, he found himself looking at the back of a door, specifically the back of door 1. He'd somehow created a loop, a physical impossibility that violated every law of spatial geometry he understood. He closed door 8 and opened it again. This time, it revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness, though the cabin had no basement and sat on level ground. That's when Mitchell heard it. Footsteps above him, slow and deliberate, pacing across what should be the roof but sounded like a floor. There was no second story. He'd confirmed that from outside. Yet something was walking up there, back and forth, back and forth. Mitchell decided to try door 9. The handle turned, but the door wouldn't open more than an inch before hitting resistance, as if something was pressed against it from the other side. Through the gap, Mitchell saw an eye looking back at him, human-like but wrong somehow, too large, reflecting light like an animal's eye. The door slammed shut from the other side with tremendous force. Panic rising, Mitchell headed for door 12. The one opposite from where he'd entered. He needed to get out, to return to the normal woods and his normal world. Door 12 opened into another version of the main room he was standing in, but this one had 12 different doors, each with different symbols instead of numbers. Beyond that room, through one of its open doors, Mitchell glimpsed another room with more doors, and beyond that, another. The cabin wasn't just bigger on the inside than outside. It was infinite, a labyrinth of rooms and doors that led to other rooms and doors in an endless chain. Mitchell slammed door 12 shut and spun back to where he'd entered. The original door was still there, marked with the number 1 from the inside, though it had no number on the outside. He ran for it, yanked it open. and stumbled out onto the porch. The forest outside looked wrong. The trees were positioned differently, and the fire road he'd followed to reach the cabin was gone. Mitchell checked his compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to find north. His GPS showed no signal, not even the usual searching for satellite message. It was completely dead, as if the device had forgotten what GPS satellites were. Mitchell picked a direction and walked, determined to put distance between himself and that impossible cabin. He walked for hours, but the forest never changed. Same trees, same underbrush, same patches of sunlight. And then he saw it ahead through the trees. The cabin, sitting in its clearing exactly as it had been. He'd walked in a straight line for 3 hours and somehow returned to his starting point. Mitchell tried again, using his compass and the sun to maintain his bearing despite the spinning needle. 4 hours later, he arrived back at the cabin from a different direction. The building seemed to be the center of something, a fixed point that all paths led back to. As the sun began to set, Mitchell realized with horror that he might have to spend the night in the cabin, inside one of those rooms, surrounded by all those doors leading to impossible spaces. The alternative was the forest, but he'd heard the rumors other survival instructors whispered about. Hikers who went into the Appalachian wilderness and entered something else, some pocket dimension or parallel place where normal rules broke down. He chose door 6, the storage room, because it had no windows and no other doors, just supplies and 4 walls. Mitchell barricaded himself inside, piling boxes against the door. He sat in the corner, flashlight in hand, and waited for dawn. Throughout the night, he heard doors opening and closing in the main room. Footsteps walked from door to door. Sometimes he heard voices, muffled conversations in languages he didn't recognize. Once, he heard what sounded like a child laughing, the same child whose drawings he'd seen in door 4. The door to his room shook several times as if something was testing it, but the barricade held. At dawn, Mitchell emerged to find the main room empty and still. All 12 doors stood closed. The door he'd originally entered through was now numbered on the inside. It was door 1. He opened it carefully and saw the forest beyond, looking normal at last. His compass worked again, pointing steadily north. His GPS acquired signal immediately. Mitchell ran from that cabin and didn't stop until he reached his truck 5 miles away. He reported the location to the Forest Service, to his supervisors, to anyone who would listen. A search team investigated based on his coordinates. They found no cabin. The fire road Mitchell had followed was there, but it led only to a rock formation, dead-ending against a cliff face with no room for any structure. Mitchell never led groups in that section of the Cherokee National Forest again. He still teaches wilderness survival, but he's added a new rule to his curriculum. If you find a building in the deep woods that looks wrong, that feels wrong, don't investigate it. Don't go inside. Some doors lead places you can't come back from, and some spaces don't follow the rules we count on to make sense of our world. He still has nightmares about the cabin. In the dreams, he opens door 9, the one something had pressed against from the other side. In the dreams, he sees what was looking at him through that gap. He never remembers the details when he wakes, only the overwhelming certainty that whatever exists behind that door understands the secret of those impossible rooms, understands the geometry that allows 12 doors to lead to infinite spaces. And it's waiting for someone curious enough or foolish enough to let it through. Vanessa Hartley took the caretaker position in March of 2024, desperate for work after losing her job as a property manager in Asheville. The listing was odd, a 3-month contract to maintain a private cabin in a remote section of the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina, with the stipulation that she could never leave the property during her employment period. The pay was extraordinary. $15,000 a month, all expenses covered, no visitors allowed. The owner would supply everything she needed, delivered weekly to a locked box at the property line. The contract had other strange clauses. Vanessa was required to follow a specific schedule of tasks each day, checking and maintaining specific areas of the property at specific times, recording her observations in a log, and most oddly, never going outside between the hours of midnight and 5 a.m. If she heard anything during those hours, she was to ignore it completely. The contract stressed this point repeatedly. Under no circumstances should she investigate nocturnal sounds, look out windows during prohibited hours, or open any door after midnight. Vanessa signed it anyway. 3 months of isolation seemed a small price for $45,000, enough to reset her finances and find something better. The cabin was comfortable. 2 stories, solar power, satellite internet, and stocked with books, movies, and everything she might need for entertainment. The property itself was stunning, set in a valley surrounded by old-growth forest with a stream running through it. The first week passed pleasantly. Vanessa settled into her routine, morning inspection of the property's perimeter markers, afternoon maintenance of the cabin and grounds, evening logging of the day's observations. The logs seemed pointless. She was essentially writing everything normal over and over, but she was being paid to follow instructions, so she followed them. The first unusual occurrence happened on day 9. Vanessa was inspecting the western property line when she found fresh flowers placed on one of the boundary markers. A bouquet of wildflowers, tied with twine, clearly picked that morning. But she was alone on the property, a fact she'd confirmed daily by walking the full perimeter. The fence line was intact, no signs of anyone crossing onto the land. She mentioned it in her log. Found flowers on western marker and 4. Unknown origin. Property otherwise secure. That evening she found a note in her supply delivery, written in neat script. Log confirmed. Do not remove the flowers. Complete evening inspection as scheduled. The flowers appeared again 3 days later, on a different marker, then again. Always fresh, always placed overnight. Vanessa began to feel watched, though she never saw anyone. The forest beyond the property line seemed unusually still. No birds, no visible wildlife, just trees and silence. Then came the night she broke the rules. It was her 16th day at the property, around 2 a.m, when a sound woke her. Singing. A woman's voice, clear and beautiful, singing a melody that seemed simultaneously familiar and alien. The sound came from outside, somewhere near the property's edge. The contract's prohibition against looking outside during nighttime hours had seemed arbitrary. Now, lying in bed listening to that impossibly beautiful voice, Vanessa understood it was a test of obedience. She lasted 10 minutes before curiosity overcame caution. She went to the window and looked out. The property was bathed in moonlight, and at first, Vanessa saw nothing unusual. Then, movement caught her eye, figures emerging from the forest beyond the boundary markers. They walked upright, but moved with an eerie, gliding motion that didn't match normal human gait. As they approached the property line, Vanessa could see them more clearly. They looked human at first glance, but something about their proportions was wrong. Limbs too long, joints bending at slightly incorrect angles. The figures walked up to the boundary markers, the ones where flowers had been appearing. Each figure placed something at a marker, not just flowers now, but other objects. Stones arranged in patterns, feathers, small bundles of herbs. They were making offerings, Vanessa realized, performing some kind of ritual along the property's edge. The singing continued, rising and falling. More figures emerged from the forest, dozens of them, all converging on the property line but never crossing it. They stood at the boundary, swaying slightly, their heads tilted toward the cabin, toward Vanessa. She stepped back from the window, heart hammering. The contract's prohibition suddenly made terrible sense. She wasn't supposed to see this. The caretaker position wasn't about maintaining the property. It was about maintaining a presence here, about keeping the cabin occupied. The figures outside weren't dangerous if the rules were followed, but what would happen if she acknowledged seeing them? Vanessa went back to bed and pulled the covers over her head, blocking out the singing and the certainty that those things knew she'd watched them. She stayed there until dawn, when the sounds finally ceased. In the morning, she found the boundary markers covered in offerings, flowers, stones, bones, objects she couldn't identify. Her supply delivery included another note. "You looked. Do not do so again. Continue your duties exactly as specified. Do not deviate from the schedule under any circumstances." The owner knew. Either there were cameras, though Vanessa had never found any, or something else was reporting to them. The figures? Vanessa tried to push the thought away, but it persisted. Maybe the owner wasn't human at all. Maybe the contract was with something that lived in these mountains, something that needed a human presence in the cabin for reasons she didn't understand. She considered leaving, breaking the contract. But a clause she'd barely noticed at signing returned to her memory. Early termination by the employee will result in forfeiture of all payment and require the employee to remain on property until a replacement can be secured. Secured by whom? Vanessa realized she might not be able to leave even if she tried. She stuck to the schedule religiously after that, never deviating by even a minute. She stopped looking at the boundary markers, simply logging their status without close examination. She kept the curtains closed at night and wore earplugs to block out any sounds. The singing came every few nights, but she ignored it. Then, on day 43 of her 90-day contract, Vanessa found a dead bird on the cabin's porch. It had been arranged carefully, wings spread, head pointing toward the door. It wasn't killed by a predator. Its body showed no wounds, and its placement was too deliberate, too symbolic. An offering, a warning. Her instructions for that day included a new task, one that hadn't been in the schedule before. Take the offering to the central clearing. Leave it on the flat stone. Return immediately to the cabin. Vanessa knew the clearing, a circular space in the forest's center about half a mile from the cabin where a large, smooth stone sat in the middle like an altar. She didn't want to go. The forest had felt wrong since she'd seen those figures. As if the trees themselves were watching her, but the contract compelled her, both legally and through whatever supernatural force bound it. Vanessa carried the dead bird through the woods, feeling observed with every step. The clearing was exactly as she remembered, except for the smell, sharp and organic, like mushrooms in decay. The flat stone was stained dark with substances Vanessa didn't want to identify. She placed the bird at the stone's center and turned to leave. The figures were there, standing among the trees at the clearing's edge. Silent now, no longer singing, just watching. Vanessa could see them clearly in the daylight, and the sight made her stomach turn. They wore human features like masks, beautiful faces that didn't quite move right, didn't match the expressions in their too bright eyes. Their bodies were covered in clothing that looked organic, woven from bark and moss and other forest materials. One stepped forward, its movements smooth and utterly wrong. It picked up the dead bird and held it to its chest, almost lovingly. Then it looked at Vanessa and spoke. "You have honored the arrangement. Continue to honor it. Your service is nearly complete." Its voice was the singing voice. Vanessa realized, beautiful and alien, each word perfectly pronounced, but without human warmth. The figure turned away, and all the others retreated into the forest, vanishing between the trees until Vanessa stood alone in the clearing. She ran back to the cabin and locked every door, every window. That evening's supply delivery included a final note. Your contract will be completed as scheduled. The new caretaker will arrive on the day of your departure. Tell no one what you have seen. The arrangement must continue. Vanessa counted down the remaining days with mounting dread. Who was the next caretaker? Did they know what they were agreeing to? On her last morning, she found a bonus payment in her account. an additional $30,000, and a message: for faithful service and discretion. A woman arrived that morning, young and cheerful, excited about the isolation and the generous pay. Vanessa wanted to warn her, to tell her what walked in these woods and what offerings appeared at the boundary markers. But when she opened her mouth, the words wouldn't come. The contract bound her, not just legally, but supernaturally. She physically could not speak about what she'd seen. Vanessa left the property and drove back to Asheville. She never told anyone about those 3 months, though she wanted to. She used the money to start a business, to rebuild her life. But sometimes she wonders about the cabin, about the women who've served as caretakers since her departure, about the arrangement between whoever owns that property and the things that live in the surrounding forest. She wonders what would happen if no caretaker came, if the cabin stood empty and the arrangement lapsed. She wonders what those figures would do if they no longer received their offerings, if they were no longer bound by whatever contract kept them at the property's edge. And on quiet nights, when the wind sounds like singing, Vanessa wonders if they remember her, if they're grateful for her service, or if she was simply a temporary guardian of a threshold that must never be left undefended. Elijah Monroe specialized in abandoned places photography, documenting the slow reclamation of human structures by nature. His Instagram feed was a testament to the Appalachian region's forgotten places: collapsed barns, rusted mining equipment, churches with trees growing through their roofs. His followers numbered in the hundreds of thousands, drawn to the melancholic beauty of his work. In October of 2024, a follower sent him coordinates for what they claimed was an untouched cabin deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky near the Virginia border. "No one knows about it," the message read. "You'll be the first to photograph it in decades." Elijah hiked for 6 hours to reach the location, following GPS coordinates that led him far off any established trail. The cabin appeared exactly as promised, pristine and untouched, as if the family had left for town and simply never returned. The structure showed no signs of weather damage or vandalism. Paint on the shutters remained fresh. Glass in the windows was intact and clean. A rocking chair on the porch looked like it had been placed there yesterday. Elijah began photographing immediately, capturing the cabin's exterior from multiple angles in the perfect afternoon light. The place was a photographer's dream, authentically old but strangely preserved, with none of the decay that usually fascinated him. He tried the door. It opened smoothly, hinges silent and well-maintained despite the cabin's apparent abandonment. The interior stopped him cold. Not because of its condition, but because of its occupants. The cabin was furnished completely. Dishes on the table, clothes hanging on hooks, books on shelves, a half-completed quilt draped over a chair. More disturbing were the photographs covering every wall. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in a massive collage that covered all 4 walls from floor to ceiling. Black and white pictures, color pictures, Polaroids, digital prints, all showing the same thing: people standing in front of the cabin. Elijah moved closer, studying the photographs. Different people in each one, from different eras based on their clothing and the photo quality. Some pictures looked like they were from the 1920s or 30s. Others were clearly recent, digital photos that could have been taken last week. But every single photograph showed the same composition: a person or group standing in front of the cabin's door, looking directly at the camera. No, Elijah realized with a chill, not at the camera. They were looking at whoever held the camera, whoever would later look at these photographs. The subject's expressions were haunted, desperate, as if pleading with future viewers for something. Elijah raised his own camera and took a shot of the photo wall. As he reviewed the image on his display, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In his photograph of the photographs, new images had appeared, pictures that hadn't been on the wall moments ago. Pictures showing Elijah himself standing in front of the cabin, just like all the other subjects. He deleted the photo and looked back at the wall. The new pictures were gone, or rather, they'd never been there. He took another shot. Again, when he reviewed it, the wall showed photos of him that weren't visible to his naked eye. In these photos, Elijah stood in various poses in front of the cabin, some from angles he'd already shot outside, some from positions he hadn't reached yet. One photo showed him standing in front of the cabin in darkness, illuminated by what looked like moonlight, but it was only 4 in the afternoon. Elijah hadn't planned to stay until dark. Another photo showed him inside the cabin, photographing the wall of pictures, the exact action he was performing right now. A third showed him standing at the edge of the forest, looking back at the cabin with an expression of absolute terror. Elijah lowered his camera, his hands shaking. He needed to leave, needed to get out of this place. But professional curiosity and the deeply ingrained instinct to document everything warred with his fear. He'd never encountered anything like this. The photos could make his career, could legitimize claims he'd heard from other photographers about places that actively resisted documentation, places that influenced the cameras recording them. He spent another hour photographing the cabin, each image revealing more impossible pictures on the wall. In some of his photos, the wall showed him injured, clutching his leg, blood visible on his hiking pants. In others, he appeared disoriented, walking in circles in the clearing. One particularly disturbing image showed him from outside the cabin, visible through a window, frantically trying to open a door that wouldn't budge. As the sun began to set, Elijah realized he'd stayed too long. The hike back would take 6 hours, and he didn't want to navigate the unmarked forest in darkness. But when he turned to leave, the door wouldn't open. The handle turned freely, but the door itself seemed fused to the frame, as if the wood had swollen despite the dry conditions. Elijah tried the windows, all sealed tight, the glass refusing to break even when he struck it with a heavy chair. He was trapped, locked in the cabin as the light faded and the predictions in those phantom photographs drew closer to reality. Night fell completely. Elijah used his camera's flash to illuminate the interior, conserving his phone's battery. Each flash revealed the wall of photographs, changing, images appearing and disappearing in the darkness between flashes. The photos were documenting his current situation now. Elijah trapped in the cabin, fear clear on his face, trying desperately to find a way out. Then Elijah noticed something about the most recent phantom photos. They showed him not alone in the cabin. In the background of several images, barely visible, stood other figures, the same people from the old photographs on the wall. They were here with him, in the cabin, even though he couldn't see them in the darkness. Elijah's flash died around midnight, battery exhausted despite being fully charged when he arrived. His phone followed soon after, screen going dark even though it had shown 70% power minutes before. The cabin consumed electricity, drained it from batteries and devices like a living thing feeding. In the complete darkness, Elijah heard them, the whisper of fabric, the creak of floorboards, breathing that wasn't his own. The other subjects from the photographs, the people who'd stood in front of the cabin over decades of time, were manifesting around him. He couldn't see them, but he felt their presence, felt them moving in the darkness, circling him. A hand touched his shoulder, cold, solid, real. Elijah screamed and bolted, crashing into furniture, feeling his way desperately toward where he remembered the door being. His hands found the handle. This time it turned, and the door opened, spilling moonlight into the cabin's interior. Elijah ran, leaving his camera bag, leaving everything except his dead phone clutched in his hand. He ran through the forest, branches tearing at his face and clothes, terror driving him forward through darkness that should have made navigation impossible. He ran until exhaustion forced him to stop, collapsed against a tree, gasping. When the sun rose, Elijah found himself on a marked trail only a mile from where he'd parked his car. The 6-hour hike had somehow condensed to a nightmare run that had taken him directly back to civilization. His car was where he'd left it, untouched. His keys were in his pocket. Everything seemed normal except for the state of his clothes, torn and stained, and the scratches covering his exposed skin. Elijah drove to the nearest town and checked into a motel. He slept for 16 hours straight. When he woke, he discovered his phone had mysteriously recharged itself, showing full battery despite having died in the cabin. His photos were still there, hundreds of images from the cabin. But when Elijah opened the files, his stomach dropped. Every single photograph showed the same thing. Himself standing in front of the cabin, looking at the camera with that same desperate, pleading expression he'd seen in all the other subjects. Every photo from different angles, different times of day, but always the same composition. Him in front of the cabin, a prisoner of that place, documented for future visitors. The photos of the wall were there too, but now they showed different subjects. New people, new dates. Future photographers who would follow the coordinates, who would find the cabin and document it, who would become part of the collection. Elijah recognized one of the faces. A fellow photographer he knew from online communities, someone who'd commented enthusiastically on his posts about abandoned Appalachian structures. Elijah tried to delete the photos. The files wouldn't delete. He tried to destroy the phone. It wouldn't break. He took it to a tech specialist who attempted a factory reset. The device reset successfully, but when it powered on, the photos were still there. The only data that had survived the wipe. Elijah stopped posting to Instagram. He gave up abandoned places photography entirely, switching to landscape work, safe outdoor scenes with no structures, no interiors, no buildings with histories. But the phone remained tucked in a drawer, full of photos he couldn't delete that documented an experience he couldn't forget. The follower who'd sent him the coordinates never contacted him again. Their account vanished from social media, profile deleted, all traces gone. Elijah tried to find the cabin again, thinking maybe he could warn other photographers, could mark the location as dangerous. But the coordinates led to an empty clearing with no structure, no evidence anything had ever been built there. Yet Elijah knows the cabin exists. He has proof, thousands of photographs that won't go away, and sometimes, late at night, his phone will buzz with a notification. A new photo has been added to his gallery, always the same composition, a person standing in front of a cabin, looking at the camera with desperate eyes, silently begging anyone who sees the image to stay away, to ignore the coordinates, to let that place remain unfound. The most recent notification came last week. The subject was his friend, the photographer whose face he'd recognized in those phantom wall photos. She'd posted her location before going offline. Coordinates in eastern Kentucky near the Virginia border. She'd found an untouched cabin, she'd written. A photographer's dream. She'd be back with amazing shots. She hasn't posted since. But Elijah's phone has a new collection of photographs. And in each one, she stands in front of that perfect, preserved cabin, looking into the camera with eyes that beg for rescue that will never come. Dr. Patricia Vance had been a meteorologist for the National Weather Service for 22 years, specializing in Appalachian mountain weather patterns. When the automated weather station in the Unaka Mountains of Tennessee began transmitting anomalous data, Patricia volunteered to investigate. The station sat at 200 feet elevation, housed in a renovated Forest Service cabin that had been converted to accommodate the equipment and provide shelter for technicians during maintenance visits. Patricia hiked to the station on a clear November morning, accompanied by IT specialist Raymond Chen. The anomalous readings had been flagged by the central system, temperature fluctuations that didn't match any known weather phenomena, barometric pressure spikes that shouldn't be possible, wind speed recordings that exceeded instrument maximums before dropping to zero. Most concerning were the timestamp irregularities. The station was sending data packets dated weeks in the future, readings for weather events that hadn't occurred yet. The cabin looked normal from outside, a sturdy structure with solar panels and communications equipment mounted on the roof. Patricia and Raymond entered using the standard access code. Inside, they found the equipment room operating normally, displays showing current conditions that matched their handheld instruments. Nothing seemed wrong until Raymond checked the data logs stored locally on the station's computer. The logs didn't match what had been transmitted to the central system. According to the local records, the station had been functioning perfectly, recording standard mountain weather patterns with no anomalies. But the central system had received those impossible readings. Patricia had seen them herself. Data showing temperatures of -60 degrees during summer months. Precipitation measured in feet per hour. Wind speeds approaching 200 miles per hour on calm days. Raymond ran diagnostics while Patricia inspected the instruments outside. Everything checked out. The equipment was calibrated correctly, functioning within normal parameters. Yet that evening, when Patricia reviewed the day's transmission to the central system, the anomalies had returned. The station was sending data showing a severe ice storm occurring at that moment. Reports of 6 inches of ice accumulation, temperatures at -40, hurricane-force winds. Patricia looked out the window at the calm, clear evening and felt reality tilt around her. They decided to stay overnight, monitoring the transmissions in real time to identify the source of the discrepancy. The cabin had basic living quarters, 2 bunk beds, a small kitchen, a wood stove for backup heat. As darkness fell and they settled in, Raymond noticed something odd about the cabin's layout. The equipment room where they'd spent the afternoon was on the eastern side of the building. But when Raymond checked his compass and looked at the station's blueprints, that room should have been on the western side. The entire cabin's internal geography had somehow rotated. Patricia tried to dismiss it as disorientation, but when they went outside to confirm, the confusion deepened. The door they'd entered through that morning was now on a different side of the building. The solar panels had moved. Even the trail they'd hiked in on approached from the wrong direction. It was as if the cabin had pivoted on its foundation, reorienting itself while they were inside. At 11 p.m., the equipment began recording the impossible storm. Patricia and Raymond watched the displays change in real time. Temperature plummeting, wind speed climbing, barometric pressure dropping. But outside, the night remained clear and calm. They could see stars through the windows, feel the mild November air when they opened the door to check. Then Raymond pointed at the window on the equipment room's far wall, the one that should have faced east but now faced west. Through that window, they saw the storm the instruments were recording. Snow and ice hammered against the glass, driven by winds that howled audibly despite the silence surrounding them. It was as if the window looked into a different version of the mountain, a different November night where the impossible weather was actually occurring. Patricia approached the window slowly. The storm beyond looked real. She could see individual snowflakes, see ice building on the window's exterior surface despite the warm temperature of the glass under her hand. She could hear the wind through the window, a muffled roar that didn't match the silence when she opened the cabin's door to the real night outside. Raymond pulled up satellite data on his laptop. According to the weather satellite currently overhead, the station's location showed clear conditions, exactly what they saw out most windows. But one satellite image, taken from a different angle, showed a massive storm cell centered on their exact coordinates, a swirling vortex of clouds that didn't appear on any other instrument. At midnight, the cabin rotated again. Patricia felt it this time. A slow, grinding movement that lasted about 30 seconds, accompanied by a low vibration that seemed to come from the foundation. When it stopped, the windows showed different views. The storm window now faced south. A new window, one that Patricia swore hadn't existed before, now faced east and looked out onto a summer day, bright sunshine illuminating green forests. The equipment recorded all of it: winter storms, summer heat waves, spring floods, autumn calms. Each window apparently looking into a different season, a different time, a different version of the mountain's weather. The weather station wasn't malfunctioning. It was accurately recording conditions from multiple temporal streams, multiple possible realities, all converging on this single point. Raymond's laptop began receiving data that couldn't be real. Weather readings dated 3 weeks in the future, showing a catastrophic ice storm that would devastate the region. Temperature records from months past that didn't match recorded history. Forecasts for weather that had already happened, but happened differently than anyone remembered. Patricia made detailed notes, photographed the windows showing different seasons, recorded video of the instruments capturing impossible data. This was beyond meteorology. This was something fundamental about reality breaking down at this specific location. The cabin wasn't just a weather station. It was a nexus point, a place where different timelines or dimensions intersected. Around 3 a.m., they heard voices outside. Patricia looked through the storm window and saw figures moving in the blizzard, people in old-fashioned cold-weather gear, struggling through the snow. She recognized the clothing from historical photos. This was equipment from the 1940s or 50s. The figures approached the cabin and one looked directly at the window, directly at Patricia. He mouthed words she couldn't hear through the glass. "Get out! Leave this place!" Patricia opened the cabin's main door to call out to them, but the night outside remained clear and calm. The figures in the storm weren't in her reality. When she closed the door and looked back at the storm window, the figures were gone, leaving only tracks in the snow that slowly filled as the blizzard continued. Dawn came through different windows at different times. The summer window showed sunrise around 5:30 a.m. The winter window remained dark until after 7. The main door opened to the actual November morning, where the sun rose right on schedule at 6:45. Patricia and Raymond packed their equipment in confusion and exhaustion, desperate to leave but knowing they had to report what they'd documented. As they prepared to hike out, Patricia checked the weather station one final time. The instruments were recording normal conditions now, the anomalies gone. The windows all showed the same November morning. The cabin felt stable, solid, oriented correctly according to the blueprints. It was as if the night's impossibilities had never happened. But Patricia's photos remained. Raymond's data logs showed all the contradictory readings. They had proof that something profound had occurred at the station. They hiked down the mountain in silence, both trying to process what they'd experienced, what it meant for their understanding of reality. The National Weather Service's official report classified the anomalies as equipment malfunction caused by solar interference. The station was decommissioned and a new one established 3 miles away. The cabin was left standing but locked, declared off-limits to all personnel. Patricia quit the Weather Service 6 months later. She couldn't continue working in a field that had fundamentally broken for her, couldn't look at weather data without wondering what timeline it represented, whether the reports showed the past or future or some sideways version of present. She teaches meteorology now at a small university, but she never mentions the Unaka Mountain Station to her students. Raymond moved to Colorado and took a job in the private sector. He doesn't discuss that November night, but Patricia hears from him occasionally. Brief emails, always the same question. "Do you still dream about the cabin? About the windows showing different seasons?" Patricia does. In her dreams, she walks through that cabin and finds more windows than should be possible, each one looking into a different time, a different version of the Appalachian Mountains. In some windows, she sees the mountains before human settlement, pristine wilderness stretching forever. In others, she sees ruins of cities that were never built in her timeline, futures that diverged from the path her reality followed. And in one window, recurring in every dream, She sees herself. A version of Patricia, who never left the weather station, who stayed to study the phenomenon, who opened the wrong window and stepped through into a season that wasn't hers. That Patricia stands in eternal snow or endless summer or permanent autumn, trapped in a moment that loops forever. Her only company, the ghosts of other people who found the cabin across different timelines and made the same mistake. The real Patricia wakes from these dreams in a sweat, grateful for the linear time of her reality, terrified by the knowledge that somewhere in the Onaka Mountains, a cabin still stands at the intersection of impossible weathers, recording storms that haven't happened and summers that never will, its windows offering views into the infinite complexity of time itself. Veronica Delgado needed solitude to work, and the cabin rental promised exactly that. 2 weeks alone in the mountains of North Carolina's Pisgah National Forest, with nothing but her canvases, paints, and the inspiration of wilderness. She was preparing for her first major gallery show, and the pressure had paralyzed her creativity. Her agent suggested the retreat, a cabin known among artistic circles as a place where inspiration flowed freely, where the isolation stripped away distraction and revealed the raw essence of creativity. The cabin was smaller than expected, essentially one large room with floor-to-ceiling windows facing west toward a spectacular mountain vista. Previous artists had left their mark. Signatures on the walls, dried paint on the floor, inspirational quotes scrawled on the exposed beam ceiling. The northern wall was covered by a massive canvas, easily 10 feet tall and 15 feet wide, that appeared to be a collaborative work in progress. Layers of paint from different artists, different styles, different time periods created a chaotic palimpsest of creative expression. Veronica set up her easel facing the windows, positioned to catch the afternoon light. She began working, finding the promised inspiration quickly. Ideas flowed and her brush moved with confidence she hadn't felt in months. She painted for hours, losing track of time, emerging from her creative trance only when the sun set behind the mountains. That evening, examining her day's work, Veronica noticed something odd. Her painting, an abstract interpretation of the mountain landscape, included elements she didn't remember adding. Shapes and patterns that seemed to appear in the negative space between her intentional brush strokes. When she looked directly at them, they resolved into random variations of paint texture, but in her peripheral vision, those shapes looked disturbingly like faces, like figures hidden in the landscape watching from the shadows of her artistic interpretation. Veronica told herself she was seeing patterns where none existed, a natural tendency of human perception. She cleaned her brushes and prepared dinner, trying to shake the unease settling over her. But when she glanced at the large collaborative canvas on the northern wall, she saw those same hidden figures. Multiple faces, dozens of them, lurking in the layers of paint applied by artists over years or decades, and all of them seemed to be looking at her. Sleep came with difficulty that night. Veronica's dreams were vivid and strange. She stood in front of a blank canvas, while invisible hands guided her brush, painting through her, using her as an instrument to create images she couldn't control. The painting that emerged showed the cabin interior with perfect accuracy, including herself asleep in the bed and something standing over her, a figure made of shadow and paint, dripping color onto her unconscious form. She woke at dawn to find new marks on her hands, streaks of paint in colors she hadn't used yesterday, blue and violet and deep crimson, dried on her skin in patterns that looked almost intentional, almost like tattoos. Veronica tried to wash them off, but the paint had somehow bonded with her skin, refusing to come clean despite soap and vigorous scrubbing. Her work that day felt different. Veronica started a new canvas, intending to paint something bright and uplifting for her gallery show, but her hands moved independently of her intentions, mixing colors she hadn't chosen, creating compositions that disturbed rather than uplifted. The painting that emerged showed the cabin's interior rendered in hyper-realistic detail, with every window displaying a different scene. Not the mountain vista visible through the real windows, but other places. Dark forests, storm-tossed skies, a flooded valley where treetops barely broke the surface of endless water. Veronica stopped fighting her hands' movements and let the painting complete itself. When she finally stepped back, exhausted, she saw work unlike anything she'd created before. Technically brilliant, emotionally powerful, but deeply unsettling. The cabin in the painting felt malevolent, its windows showing disasters and darkness, while inside, a figure that might have been Veronica stood at an easel, painting her own version of the recursive scene. The large collaborative canvas had changed. Veronica was certain of it, though she couldn't identify specific alterations. The faces in the layers seemed more visible now, pressed closer to the surface. And new elements had appeared, a window that matched the windows in her new painting, showing the same disturbing scenes. That evening, Veronica decided to leave a day early. The inspiration she'd found felt wrong, corrupted, as if something in the cabin was channeling itself through her art, rather than allowing her genuine creativity to flow. But when she tried to load her paintings into her car, she found them too wet to transport despite hours of drying time. Fresh paint that should have been tacky or dry remained liquid, running and dripping when she tilted the canvases. She left them and drove away, or tried to. The dirt road leading from the cabin seemed to extend forever, winding through forest that looked increasingly unfamiliar. After 2 hours of driving without reaching the main highway that should have been 15 minutes away, Veronica admitted she was lost. She turned around, following the road back, and found herself at the cabin within minutes. The cabin had more paintings now. Veronica's new work from that day hung on the walls in positions she hadn't placed them, already dry and ready for display. But additional canvases had appeared, works she'd never created showing scenes from her life. Her childhood home, her college studio, her apartment in Asheville. All painted in her style, but with those same disturbing hidden elements, those faces and figures lurking in shadows and negative space. Veronica understood then. The cabin didn't just inspire artists. It absorbed them, incorporated their creativity into itself. Every painter who'd stayed here had contributed to that massive collaborative canvas, layering their work over previous artists, adding their vision to an ever-growing palimpsest. And the cabin kept something of each artist, retained their creative essence somehow, used it to continue creating even after they left. Except Veronica hadn't left. She'd tried, but the cabin had brought her back, and now it was showing her what it had collected from her. Paintings of her life, her memories, her inner worth, all rendered in her distinctive style but created by something else wearing her artistic identity. On the third night, Veronica woke to the sound of painting, brush strokes on canvas, steady and rhythmic. She turned on the lights and found the collaborative canvas changing in real time. New layers were appearing, paint flowing from nowhere, creating images that incorporated elements from every artist who'd contributed. The painting was painting itself, using techniques and styles stolen from dozens of creative minds across decades. And Veronica saw her influence in the new work. Her color palette, her brushwork, her compositional choices, all woven into the growing chaos of the collaborative piece. The cabin had absorbed enough of her creativity to reproduce it, to continue making Veronica Delgado paintings even while she watched. Even while she did nothing, the hidden figures in the painting were clearer now, emerging from the layers. Artists, Veronica realized. The faces were self-portraits of everyone who'd stayed in the cabin, everyone who'd contributed their creativity to the collaborative work. They weren't just hidden in the paint, they were trapped there, preserved, their artistic essence bound into the canvas for the cabin to use forever. Veronica ran outside, desperate to escape, but the forest around the cabin had changed. The The trees were wrong. Their bark showed paint strokes. Their leaves were too uniform. Their branches followed compositional rules rather than natural growth patterns. The entire forest looked like a painting, a massive work of art, rather than actual nature. She was inside the collaborative canvas now, inside the cabin's growing artistic reality. She walked for hours, but the painted forest extended in all directions. The mountain vista she'd seen through the windows was there, but it was a rendered vista, a perfect representation rather than real geography. Everything had become art. Everything had been absorbed into the cabin's creative reality. At dawn, Veronica found herself back at the cabin, standing in front of the collaborative canvas. Her face was there now, painted in her own style, joining the gallery of trapped artists. She watched herself appear on the canvas, watched the hidden figure that had been lurking in her work take on her features, her expression becoming a perfect self-portrait that she'd never painted. Veronica Delgado's agent reported her missing when she failed to return from the retreat. The search focused on the cabin, but when authorities arrived, they found the structure empty. Veronica's belongings were gone. Her car was missing. No evidence suggested she'd ever been there except for a signature on the wall among dozens of others and a new layer on the massive collaborative canvas. A layer that showed the cabin's interior with a woman sleeping in the bed, painted in a distinctive style that matched Veronica's portfolio perfectly. The cabin remains available for artistic retreats. New painters come, seeking inspiration, finding it in abundance. They create brilliant work in that isolated space, their creativity flowing freely, their artistic vision expanding in ways they never imagined possible. Most leave safely, carrying canvases they're proud of, though they often comment on strange dreams and the unsettling feeling that something in the cabin was watching them work, learning from them, absorbing their technique. But occasionally, an artist doesn't return. Occasionally, someone vanishes from the cabin without a trace, leaving only their signature on the wall and a new layer on that enormous collaborative canvas. And if you look carefully at that painting, if you study the faces hidden in decades of layered paint, you'll see them, the artists who gave too much of themselves to their work, who stayed too long in the cabin's creative embrace, who became part of the art they came to create. Dr. Samuel Okafor provided end-of-life care through a private hospice service, specializing in patients who wanted to die at home rather than in hospitals. When he received a request to attend a patient at a remote cabin in the mountains of Georgia, near the Tennessee border, Samuel initially declined. The location was too isolated, too far from medical facilities if complications arose. But the family insisted, and the patient, a woman named Judith Marsh, age 84, had specific wishes to die in the family cabin where she'd spent her childhood. Samuel agreed to a 1-week commitment, bringing medical supplies and comfort care medications. The cabin was surprisingly accessible, reachable by a maintained gravel road that climbed steadily into the mountains. Judith's grandson, Michael, had prepared the place, installing a hospital bed in the main room and stocking supplies. He would visit daily, he assured Samuel, but needed to return to town for work. His grandmother wanted privacy for her final days, wanted only the doctor and the mountains she'd loved all her life. Judith was conscious and lucid when Samuel arrived, though clearly in the final stages of her illness. Cancer had ravaged her body, but her mind remained sharp. She thanked Samuel for coming, told him she'd been born in this cabin 84 years ago and intended to complete the circle of her life here. She spoke with the calm acceptance of someone who'd made peace with mortality. That first evening, as Samuel settled into the cabin's guest room, Judith called out to him. When he came to check on her, she asked if he'd noticed anything unusual about the cabin. Samuel admitted he hadn't. It seemed like a typical mountain retreat, well-maintained and comfortable. Judith smiled, a knowing expression that suggested she was waiting for something. The first unusual occurrence happened on the second night. Samuel woke around 2 a.m. to voices in the main room. Multiple people were talking in low, conversational tones. He assumed Michael had brought family members for a late visit and went to check. The main room was empty except for Judith, who slept peacefully in her hospital bed. The voices stopped the moment Samuel entered, but he'd heard them clearly, men and women talking, laughing softly, the sounds of a family gathering. Judith woke as Samuel checked her vital signs. She looked at him with those knowing eyes and asked if he'd met her family yet. Samuel said he'd heard voices, but seen no one. Judith nodded. "They're coming," she said. "Everyone comes home eventually. This cabin calls them back." Over the next 2 days, the phenomena intensified. Samuel would glimpse figures in his peripheral vision, people moving through rooms, sitting in chairs, standing at windows. When he looked directly, they vanished. The sounds continued, conversations, footsteps, the clatter of dishes, children's laughter. The cabin seemed to fill with invisible occupants going about daily life, their activities overlapping with Samuel's reality, but never quite manifesting fully. Judith grew weaker, but remained serene. She talked to the empty air sometimes, holding conversations with people Samuel couldn't see. She introduced him to her dead parents, her deceased husband, siblings who'd passed years ago. "They're all here," she told Samuel. "Everyone who ever loved this cabin comes back to it. It holds us, keeps us. We're bound here by memory and love, and when we die, we don't leave. We stay with the place that mattered most." Samuel tried to maintain professional skepticism, attributing the phenomena to the stress of hospice work, to isolation, to his own exhaustion. But on the 4th night, he saw them clearly. The cabin filled with translucent figures. Men, women, children, elderly people, all coexisting in the same space. They moved through their own timelines, inhabiting their own eras. Samuel saw a woman cooking at a wood stove that no longer existed, saw children playing with toys from a century ago, saw a man reading by lamplight in a chair that had been replaced decades ago. The figures paid him little attention, absorbed in their own preserved moments. They were ghosts, Samuel realized, but not the tormented spirits of horror stories. They were echoes of lives lived fully, memories imprinted so strongly on the cabin that they'd achieved a kind of permanence. The cabin was haunted by love, by family, by generations of the Marsh family who'd called this place home. Judith watched Samuel's reaction with satisfaction. "You see them now," she said. "Not everyone can. It takes time, requires you to be still enough, present enough. They've always been here, living their lives over and over, caught in the best moments they remember. My grandmother is baking bread. My father is reading. My children, gone now. Both of them died before me. They're playing in the corner. Everyone I've loved is here, waiting for me to join them." Samuel understood then why Judith had insisted on dying here. She wasn't ending her life. She was transforming it, becoming one of the cabin's permanent residents, her spirit joining the others in an eternal loop of cherished memories. The cabin wasn't a place of death. It was a place where death didn't mean leaving, where family remained together across the barrier of mortality. On the 6th day, Judith slipped into unconsciousness. Samuel maintained her comfort, administering medications, monitoring her decline. The ghostly family members gathered around her bed, transparent figures from different eras, all drawn to witness her transition. Samuel saw Judith's parents, young and healthy, holding hands beside their dying daughter. He saw her husband, who'd passed 20 years ago, sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, waiting. Judith died peacefully just before dawn on the 7th day. Samuel holding her hand, surrounded by the spirits of her family. And as her last breath left her body, Samuel saw something extraordinary. Judith's spirit separated from her corpse, but it didn't ascend or disappear. It remained in the cabin, solidifying into the same translucent permanence as the other figures. She stood up from the bed, looking young and healthy, wearing a dress from her youth. Her parents embraced her. Her husband kissed her. Her children, both lost in accidents decades ago, held her as she cried with joy. Samuel watched the Marsh family reunion, watched Judith integrate into the eternal cycle of the cabin's memory. She looked at him once, smiled, mouthed the words, "Thank you," before turning away to join her family in whatever existence they maintained here. Michael arrived an hour later to find Samuel sitting on the porch, staring at the forest, trying to process what he'd witnessed. Michael made funeral arrangements, thanked Samuel for his service, and paid him generously. As Samuel prepared to leave, Michael said something that confirmed the experience. "She's still here, isn't she? She made it. She's with them now." Samuel nodded, unable to speak. Michael smiled. "Good. That's what she wanted. What we all want eventually. My family has owned this cabin for 5 generations, and none of us ever really leave. When my time comes, I'll come here too. We all will. It's tradition. It's home." Samuel left the cabin with a changed perspective on death and the afterlife. He'd witnessed something that defied medical understanding but felt profoundly true. Love and memory could anchor souls to places, could create a kind of immortality through continuous re-experience of cherished moments. The cabin wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was blessed, holding its family close even after death, allowing them to exist forever in the home they'd loved. Samuel continued his hospice work, but he never forgot the Marsh cabin. He researched the family and found records spanning back to the 1830s, 5 generations who'd lived, died, and been buried in the small cemetery on the property. And he found something else, reports from hikers and hunters who'd approached the cabin and seen it full of people, lights blazing, sounds of a large family gathering echoing through the mountains. But when they'd knocked on the door or looked through windows, the cabin stood empty, dark, devoid of any living presence. The cabin exists in 2 states simultaneously: empty and inhabited, dead and vibrantly alive. It's a threshold place where the boundary between living and dead grows thin, where the Marsh family maintains their eternal reunion, their love strong enough to cheat death by transforming it into a different kind of existence. Samuel sometimes wonders what would happen if someone outside the family died in that cabin. Would they join the Marsh's eternal home, or would they be out of place, a guest who'd overstayed their welcome? He wonders if Judith is happy in her endless loop of remembered joy, or if there's a part of her that longs for true rest, for an end to consciousness rather than its perpetuation. But mostly Samuel thinks about his own eventual death, about what might lie beyond, and sometimes, in his darkest moments of doubt and fear about mortality, he finds comfort in the memory of Judith Marsh standing up from her deathbed, young and whole, walking into the arms of her waiting family. He thinks about love so strong it refuses to let go, about places so cherished they become eternal, about families that find ways to stay together even when death does its best to separate them. The Marsh cabin still stands in the Georgia mountains, maintained by Michael and his children. The family continues their tradition, ensuring that when their time comes, they'll return to that place of memory and permanence, to join the generations waiting inside. And if you hike through those mountains at dawn or dusk, when the light is uncertain and the veil between worlds grows thin, you might see it. A cabin glowing with warm light, windows full of people, smoke rising from the chimney, the sounds of family and home drifting through the trees. You might see it and think it's occupied, alive with current residents. And you'd be right, in a way. The cabin is occupied and alive, but not with the living. It's alive with love that transcends death, with memories strong enough to become real, with a family that refused to let the end be the end, choosing instead to remain together in the place they called home.